Everyone, welcome to another edition of the Founder Wisdom Podcast, Author Wisdom Edition. Today we have Merle James Yost with us. He is an author, a writer, workshop leader, and psychotherapist. So, Merle, welcome to the podcast. Tell us a bit more about yourself.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I think you covered a lot of ground there very quickly. I've been a psychotherapist for over 30 years. I've published 6 books. I've been doing workshops for years, but I'm about to introduce a new program called 7 Steps to Powerful Boundaries. It'll debut in mid-October.
Very nice. Well, let's start with boundaries, shall we? I have problems with boundaries. I mix like personal and business a lot. And in my opinion, well, this can be good because it makes me more consistent. I know that us humans have various personalities in different contexts, but I tend to be pretty much very similar in personal and business. And I think it makes me an honest person, but also it is bad because when there's no boundaries, limits can be crossed and then you don't really know what to do, how to react. So tell us about boundaries first, the definition of boundaries, and some tips for business leaders that need them.
Wow. The most basic definition of boundaries is knowing what is me and what is not me, or what is you and what is not you. And so much of our socialization and programming is around feeling other people's feelings and so forth. And that's actually wrong. You should never feel another person's feelings. You should never merge with them. That's bad because then you get confused as to what's you and what's not you. The most better approach there is something I call being a profound witness. When somebody is upset or somebody has joy of something, they're wanting a witness to that experience so that it's reflected back to them and it's validated. And particularly if you're upset or sad about something, having that validated is really the piece. Feeling your feelings is rude and intrusive to actually merge with another person. And we get that in so many parts of our life, like marriage. I mean, I used to sing a lot, and I would do these weddings, and they'd have these 2 candles. They'd light one candle, then they'd blow out the other 2 candles, just like the separate individual ceased to exist. And that's a great way to destroy relationships and destroy sex in a relationship, because the more merged you are, the less sex there is, because the excitement happens at the contact boundary. When you start merging, you're killing the excitement. And that's why so many relationships end up with bed death. They stop being sexual because they're too merged. There's nothing there to bounce up against. And that's where the excitement happens. And this happens in relationships of all kinds. But
what about masturbation? A lot of people have fun with themselves and find that very fun. So what about that?
That's perfectly fine.
But
if you're in a relationship, that can be problematic.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I mean, okay, I mean, various interesting points here. Where to start? Well, first, isn't what they teach us to be empathetic towards the other? I think that, well, to establish boundaries and specifications with the points that you're trying to make, your point is to understand and try to understand and feel what the person feels, but not like put yourself in their shoes too much. Like, what's your point exactly there?
Well, I don't think you're trying to feel what they're feeling. I think you're trying to validate that their feelings are real. I think that you're trying to reflect them back to them so that they can really take in their own experience and feel like it's acknowledged and seen by another person. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about that in these moments of crisis, when you're in real pain, that you want the person you love there holding the space for you, not intruding upon you, but actually being there and holding space, because that act alone is what makes you feel better, because you're not alone.
Okay. And yet, when you get to feel other people's emotions too much, also, that can certainly be tricky. As a business leader, I get to see lots of emotions in my business. And I think that in the past, I would try to dive in too much and try to be too touchy-feely as per se. Nowadays, I find myself being more understanding as per these emotions, but also being quite firm and being stable, because I think also another disadvantage, put yourself, well, in someone's situation that it makes you shaky while they might need something that's stable. Am I right in saying that?
Well, yeah, you're the outside part person that's holding the space. Because if you're in there bouncing around in the swimming pool with them, then you're missing the broader perspective, which is what's going to be useful for them, and also just the witnessing of their experience.
Mm. And don't other humans like to draw others down when they feel these negative emotions? Don't they want others to also feel that way? Isn't that what like humans that or the primal beast that we are try to do?
Well, I think that's how we're socialized. Do I think that's healthy or useful? No. And there's certainly people that want, if they're miserable, want everybody to be miserable. But that seems a little narcissistic to me, as opposed to just simply being there in your own stuff and
Yeah.
letting other people hold you through that. It being jumping in this big pool together doesn't solve anything.
Are most humans like from the start as narcissist and self-centered?
Well, sure, we're born narcissistic. Narcissism is not having an internal sense of self. That means that I can't distinguish me from you. And so everything is just all one big glom, one big puddle. And so, when what's supposed to happen in childhood is that the parent is supposed to continually reflect back the external experience of the child. From 0 to 18 months, the parent is merged with the child because the child can't tell them what they need. They have to be able to figure that out. But at 18 months to 3 years of age, the parent slowly withdraws. And by 3 years of age, the parent has to be completely out of there because otherwise they're intruding upon the ability of the child to build their own sense of self. And if you don't build a sense of self, then you're completely merged with everybody that's going on, and whatever they're feeling or expressing is what you're feeling, and you don't know who you are or what's going on. So you exist in the reflection that you get back from the other person, and that's dangerous.
How does one fix that if because they don't have control on their parents being being supposed to do what they were supposed to do? If one has got that education experience, how do they kind of fix themselves back up and become less narcissistic, if you want?
Well, it's a lot of therapy, classic psychodynamic therapy, which the therapist then takes the place of that parent and continually reflecting back the person's experience. It takes typically about 8 to 12 years of having
Wow.
that in adulthood. I've done it. I've done it with a number of clients. You see, when they're walking around, it's like being in this giant play, and then nothing is really real. It's just all characters in a play. And at some point, about the 10th year, they'll come in there and say, everything got real. Everything just like got real. And so it's like completely shifts their whole perspective of being in the world. Because if you really have a full narcissistic personality disorder, it's all just an extension of you. If that car crashes out there, it had something to do with you. And that's like babies or children, when something bad happens because they're naturally narcissistic, that if mom and dad are fighting, it's their fault because they don't have any way to separate this. Oh, they're at it again. No, it's because it's about them. And so that's the problem when you're narcissistic. It's all about you.
And what most people what are most people facing as problems when it comes to boundaries? What and can you also tell about like business leaders what they should and probably should not do when managing a team and emotions in that team?
Oh, it's a complex question or a complex answer. Uh, so the first is that we're socialized to merge with people, to feel their feelings, to be in that experience with them. And that's the first problem because you're creating this mess. And so you lose your perspective, you're absorbing their feelings, they're absorbing your feelings. Then you have to sort of, is this mine or is that theirs? And you're like, ah, and it's just crazy making. So if you never do that in the first place, things are a lot cleaner because, okay, this is me, this is you. And then you can actually, as a manager, you have a better opportunity to reflect back what you're seeing in this employee at the time. And then they have the opportunity to hang out with that. But you could do that in a way that isn't condescending or mean or rude, but just simply an obvious statement of what you seem really upset right now. And what is it that you need? That's what a good leader would do at this moment in order to address that situation.
Is
As opposed
leadership like parenthood kind of?
to, again,
Is leadership similar to
oh,
parenthood?
sure, we recreate our families at work. Any unfinished business we have with our parents, our boss becomes one of those parents, and then we're acting out that whole stuff with them, and that's what we're seeing through them. That's why it's so important to work through your stuff. And so, yeah, being a boss is really just being a good parent. Again, you don't want to get as deep into their stuff as you would as a parent and a child,
Mm.
but it's still the same kind of reflection and acknowledgement and management, and because parents are managers.
Sure, yeah. And
Really managers.
yeah, I can see that dynamic. I mean, unfinished business as a child. I mean, that's so true. I can see it in, yeah, at work. I can also see it as my relationship. I think that spouse,
Yes.
us men, we look to our ladies like mothers, and they look at us as their dads. You know, sometimes.
Well, but we, yes, we marry our parents, and we usually marry the parent that we have the most difficulty with because we're trying to resolve that on some level. I always say, you're going to marry your parent, just make it a healthier version.
That's kind of funny. Um, what happened during COVID, and how did that impact the psychology in the workplace?
Well, I can tell you that therapists have never been so busy, and therapists are just book solid because of COVID, because it forced all this isolation. And so
Hmm.
all of the coping skills that people had to do to be out in the world suddenly stopped because they were just home and facing themselves alone. And so I think it's interesting that the remote work and how that's impacted, because I think it's a much more difficult situations in some ways to manage. In other ways, it makes it a lot easier. But but again, there's still people are going to be playing out their stuff with their boss and their parent. Oh, he's always on my ass, or he's always this, he's always that, or she's always doing this to me, because they can only see themselves as a victim, and you can't stop that. They're just going to do that. It just may not be a good fit for this particular position or a company, but I think the more that bosses can be aware that there are essentially a parent, they're an authority figure, and so consequently they have to own that and not try to be everybody's best friend and make everybody like them, because you're not going to be liked as a boss. Just how it
Yeah,
works.
most of the time, yeah, you're right. Coming back to the self-centered theory in psychology, or narcissistic, if you want to be intense about it, do most psychotherapists get into psychotherapy to kind of fix themselves, and do most coaches get into coaching to fix themselves?
There's an old expression about people who go to graduate school in psychology are either there to heal their family or to heal themselves. And my joke was, well, it certainly wasn't for my family.
Okay.
And a good therapist has done, I did 17 years of personal therapy, 2 years of group therapy, a 3 year or 2 year training, professional training program, and 20 plus years of consultation. So
Hmm.
most therapists, unfortunately, don't do that much self work.
Huh.
They just think they're going out there and dispense advice and people will like them. I can
Hmm.
tell you as a therapist, you spend a lot of time not being liked.
Yeah. But you're just like a boss, kind of. So
Yes,
your parents, they don't really, your patients, they don't really reflect the love that you reflect onto them, right?
some do. I mean, eventually they get there if they can take in the caring, but a lot of people are allergic to caring because the price was so high in their families to be cared about that it's toxic.
Okay.
So yeah, every person is different, and the experience they had growing up and the reaction to it, and it complicates it all.
So how does one psychotherapist maintain his sanity and his boundaries?
Well, the first is to do their work. The second is to understand how boundaries work, and a shocking number of therapists do not know. But third is to get consultation. You talk to somebody else who's more experienced, who then can reflect back to you what's going on, so that you get a better picture and you get your blind spots erased, so that you can actually see what's happening with the client and yourself.
I know you're,
Doesn't a good boss do that as well? Don't they consult with other bosses or more
yeah.
superior
I
older
have
bosses
masterminds, I have coaches, I have
yes, to give them
psychotherapists too.
perspectives they don't have. Yes, exactly. That's
Yeah,
essential because we
super
don't know it
important.
all. We can't know what we haven't experienced. So,
Yeah, yeah, very good. What are your thoughts on sexual addiction in our modern times? And do you believe it to be somewhat of a grand threat to humanity vs other types of addictions out there, or stuff that could prevent us humans from greatness?
Well, I don't believe in sexual addiction. I think it's a silly concept. I think it's a misuse of the whole addiction model.
Okay.
People who are sexually compulsive or have usually have what we call a repetition compulsion based upon having virtually everybody has some sexual abuse history. Some a lot more than others. I mean, we tend to focus it on women, but I can tell you boys get sexually abused almost as much as women.
Mm.
It just looks differently sometimes. But we have this trauma from these early sexual experiences, and that puts us into this loop because we're trying to resolve that, unconsciously trying to figure out, and that's what creates a repetition compulsion or compulsive behavior. And so they're just acting this out. And to label that an addiction is doing a disservice to them, because instead of working at resolving the trauma and healing that, they're like, oh, I have this lifelong issue around sex and blah, blah, blah. And it's just silly.
Okay. Just like self flagellation, like it
Yes,
doesn't lead to anything.
not the
And
good thing.
how's that different from an alcohol addiction? Or is it just the words that you don't like that is kind of pejorative, and oh, I have this, I need to be treated with whatever, and or if I can be treated. So what is the difference between these other forms of addiction?
Well, alcohol and drugs are a substance. They produce a specific chemical response inside the body. So
But
if you
isn't
like,
porn the same, or like seeing
it
a
may
lady
trigger
underdressed?
it may trigger the abuse in some form, or it may be the escape, but it's a very different experience than literally putting a chemical inside of your body, because you
Okay,
can change your mood at any moment. You have the ability to shift that, where if you've got a chemical in your body, you don't have that option. You have to wait till it wears off.
true. True, but I would argue that some chemicals, for example, if you get triggered, whatever is your sexual trigger, and by walking in the streets, for example, well, your brain secretes some hormone, and that
Sure.
hormone will stay in the blood for maybe a bit less time, obviously, than alcohol, but it will still stay there for like 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, even. So isn't that also a form of addiction, as per
Well,
se?
that's sort of like how they've tried to frame it, but again, we know enough about the mind to know that you can, knowing what's going on in this moment, you can shift it. You can actually do something that will counteract that hormone by releasing another one, by
So
putting
how can you do that? For example, if you get triggered, let's say you walk in the streets and you see someone that you kind of like, but you're in a relationship, in a committed relationship, and your old demons kind of surface up, and you're like, I'm getting excited here. So what do you do in those cases to kind of shift the mood?
well, in that moment, you pull yourself back inside because you've gone all the way over there. You have a fantasy going on about that person in that moment. And so you've abandoned yourself. So the first thing you have to do is take a breath, pull yourself back inside and quiet down, because you went running off down the street. And so the moment that you do that, you can immediately shift your state. That's well proven. That's the whole point of meditation.
Mm.
It's about taking you back and putting you inside. Uh, and again, that's where the psychotherapy comes in to resolve the trauma that's creating this experience of abandoning yourself because of probably some early sexual trauma or too early exposure to porn, which is how most boys get the initial sexual abuse. And so consequently, that has to be resolved.
So how's porn a sexual abuse, for example? It's
Well,
like an intrusion, kind of. It's not natural, obviously. It's technology, I think most technology is almost some kind of intrusion in our life. It's so new and novel. So how's that form of abuse?
well, particularly for young children, and this happens to boys and girls, is that their brains are not developed. You don't really, your brain isn't really fully developed around age 25. And so you're really going through all this process. And so a 12-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 14-year-old kid, his brain is a long way from developed. So they have their first exposure to sex in an overt way via porn. And it's suddenly going to stir up a whole host of energy and emotions inside them, over sexualize them and over excite them, is the
Mm.
word I'm going to use. And so consequently, it's like plugging a 110 appliance into a 240 outlet.
Yeah.
consequently it blows them up. And so that's, they get stuck, and that's where that repetition compulsion comes from, because they're trying to unconsciously resolve this overwhelming feeling that they don't know how to manage or to process.
With that being said, shouldn't there exist laws or at least education around how to use porn productively? It's probably not the word, but with moderation, if that is so like addictive. Because, you know, when I was young, for example, in my case, it was video games and porn. By the way, both share a lot of similarities. Both release serotonin and dopamine in the brain. So like what could be done around this? Because I feel that most generation in US and Canada, for example, well, if we talk about boys, at least 50% of them will be hooked on video games and porn. How could we improve that situation?
Well, first, we need to keep porn away from kids. We do a really crappy job of doing that. And then we don't educate them about it so that when they do come across it, they have a different perspective on what they're seeing. They're just completely overwhelmed by this. So we need to do much more basic sexual education from a very early age. Video games, I think first, I don't play video games. So let's be honest about that. It wasn't part of my generation growing up. I'm much too old for
Yeah.
that. But um, I
How
think
can one educate his kids about porn and video games and the moderate use of it, knowing
yeah,
that the competition is the boring education system and maybe sports? Sports could provide some competition to porn and
well,
video
they need
games.
outlets. They need a place to put this aggression, to put
Yeah,
these experiences that they're getting via the video games. And they're, unfortunately, I think kids are less and less social, oddly enough.
because
So
of video games and because
yeah,
of
it's really,
isolations with COVID. Imagine like what these 2 years did to these young
oh
minds. You know,
yeah.
it's terrible.
Well, that's the, so getting them out of the living room and the game station and out into the world and doing things are really an essential part of helping them develop as people, to learn these interactive social skills and all those things. That we're really worried about this young generation of kids who miss 2 years of socialization, and particularly the 2, 3, 4 year olds. Those are crucial times, those play dates and so forth. So we're really concerned about what's going to happen to them as they grow up, because they missed this. And it's true for all the younger kids who are doing this schooling in isolation. And so people become scary. So they've been really programmed in a whole lot of ways that's going to profoundly impact them the rest of their lives.
Yeah, lots of stuff to solve. Could we introduce meditation in the curriculum to
Sure.
teach them at least how to manage their emotions and their energies? How could we do that with young kids if I myself did not get accustomed to meditation before I was 17 and I was one of the only one doing so?
Uh, we need to make that. Some schools are actually making an effort to do that. I think they're the exception rather than the rule. But there's too many people that see it as a religious thing or something, or it's anti-religion of their religion. And so that's where it gets complicated doing it in the schools. But yes, people need to be taught from very early age to go inside, to stay with themselves. And so they have that separation of what's you and what's not you, and what's me and what's not me, because we don't really get taught that, and that then messes up everything.
Yeah. Well, interview's over, Merle. That was very good. Thank you so much for your time. Where can people find out more about you and your book?
Great. Well, thank you. Oh, how did you say how? Well,
Yeah,
they can
yeah.
always go to my
Yeah, where?
website, merleyost,
Unspokenboundaries.com and so forth.
merleyost.com, merleyost.com. And my last book is called Facing the Truth of Your Life. And it's as confrontive as the title. So just know it's just not a light and fluffy read. But I can't tell you how many guys have told me reading the book that their sexual compulsivity just stopped. It
Wow.
just came to an end because they had a whole different understanding of who they were and what this was. So it really shifted it for them. So if you're sexually compulsive, it's a really great book to read, because I really go after a lot of the things that we're talking about here and how you became you.
So interesting. So Facing the Truth of Your Life on
Yes.
Amazon. That was Merle
Yeah.
James Yost. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Merle. Have yourself a great day, man.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.